Well, there you have it. The Iraqi military simply fell apart when faced by ISIS, and in doing so, as Manuel mentioned, turned over so much military equipment to the group. How much are we talking about? Well, take this into consideration. The U.S. military left in Iraq about 4 million pieces of equipment valued at $580 million. However, the military said that they were saving $1 billion in shipping costs by not bringing it back to the States. And yet that's not much of a savings when we're now sending $500 million to the FSA to fight ISIS. So here we are. ISIS has control of portions of Syria and northern Iraq. What do we do about them? What should the role of the U.S. be in taking on ISIS? My next guest says that ISIS must be stopped, must be opposed, but is not truly a threat to the U.S. Jason Stapleton joins me now from Kansas City. He is a former Marine and host of the Jason Stapleton Show. And Jason, I know it's incorrect to ever say former Marine because you're never really a former Marine, but we do appreciate you being on today.
Thanks so much.
Tell me, so is it difficult, for the U.S. to, after we've, pushed this role in the creation of ISIS, to simply step back now and take our hands off and say, it's not our problem anymore? How do we do that?
That's the hardest thing that you could possibly do because we created the mess. But the problem is if you look at U.S. policy and what we've done so far in our nation-building campaign to first oust Saddam and then later Egypt, Mubarak, and then later Libya and Syria, we see that in every single case what we've done is create massive power vacuums. And as you've correctly reported on over the course of your piece here, what you've really created is the necessity of a U.S. military in order to provide stability because there is no solid, stable foundation there. And it doesn't matter how long you're there. We were in 10 years in Iraq. It doesn't matter how long you're there. As soon as you pull out, as soon as you pull back, unless you're going to take Iraq as a U.S. province, as soon as you pull out, you're going to see these militants come back in to try and secure power.
Saddam Hussein was not a good leader, certainly. Muammar Gaddafi was not a good leader in Libya. Both were secular leaders in charge of functioning societies, and that's something that I think we tend to forget, especially in a post-Iraq war era, post-Libya era, is that we look back as if those nations were not functioning. They were functioning societies. That is no longer the case after U.S. military intervention. Is that what creates the opportunity for ISIS in what we've seen in the last year or so?
Well, absolutely. You got to ask yourself the question, how did the evil dictators become evil dictators? Well, they became the evil dictator in a now functioning and stable country because they were able to fend off all of the other evil potential dictators that weren't able to come to power because they were the most brutal and the most successful at achieving and controlling the populace. And so to suggest that somehow you're going to turn that over and you're going to have a bunch of people who are going to come in and we're going to establish a functional republic in Iraq or in Egypt, and that these guys we're going to have an Arab Spring and everybody's going to love freedom and liberty in those parts of the world. That's not the way it works there. And the idea that you're going to do that is really a failure of U.S. policy, a massive failure and a massive misunderstanding of the way the world actually works and the way the Middle East is structured.
When you say the way that the world actually works, I'm going to ask you something here, and it's a little difficult to find words for because people will hear you start to say it and then they think it's, it seems strange. But our way of doing warfare today is so different than in empires past and leading nations around the world in the past, in which if you went to war and you fought with another nation, you would conquer it and you would keep it. You would actually take ownership of it. But we don't have a policy of that anymore. And I'm not advocating for that policy, but at least that makes more sense than going in and blowing up a country, basically destroying the infrastructure, toppling the government, and then leaving. It's almost as if we're no longer in a state of imperialism, but in a state of constant war. Am I getting that incorrect?
No, you're absolutely correct. And you've got people in Washington like John McCain who advocate this sort of thing. There's never a war that doesn't need to be fought. There's never democracy that doesn't need to be spread. The problem is they're terrible at it. If Iraq wasn't a big enough education for us, then Egypt should have been. And if Egypt wasn't, Libya should have been. And if Libya wasn't, Syria should have been. Every time we try this is a disaster. And now, of course, U.S. policy is there's never a question of whether we should go at all, whether we should just turn around and go home and say, look, we've screwed things up enough here. Let's go home and just let this place sort itself out. No, the question is always, the debate is always, well, should we just bomb them or should we send ground troops back in? What's the answer? To send ground troops back in for another 10 years? Until what? When we decide to pull out, what do you think is going to happen? There is no good solution here. We've wrecked this entire thing. And the only suitable solution is just to simply withdraw and say, look, we've got to let whatever happens, because we've been an utter failure in our attempt to spread democracy to the Middle East.
When you say that we've wrecked this entire thing, though, I mean, the reality is when we went into Iraq in the first place, we went in there under the auspices of a lie. The idea that Saddam Hussein was somehow connected to 9/11, which we knew that he was not, also connected to the idea that Saddam Hussein was harboring and creating a safe haven for al-Qaeda, which he was not, yes, or that he had weapons of mass destruction, which it turned out he did not. In fact, the only chemical weapons that we dug up during the Iraq War were the ones that we provided to Saddam to fight the Iranians in 1980. So at some point, are we in a position where, because the whole thing started from this false pretense that there is no good answer, because the entire thing is based upon fallacy and untrue arguments?
When you base your doctrine around a philosophy of preemption, keep in mind, we're doing the exact same thing with Iran now. Netanyahu was just in town trying to convince America to do a preemptive war and preemptive strikes against Iran. So we're trying to continue this vicious cycle. And when you have a doctrine of preemption, what you do is create a massive mess, because you're exactly right. The rules that we use, the rationale we use to justify going to Iraq turned out to be faulty. And the fact of the matter is that any war of preemption and aggression is a philosophy of tyrants. And I don't think that's what America is. I don't think that's what America wants to be. And even if we did want to be that, just look at the results. The results speak for themselves.
Now, I want to ask you finally here, we're short on time, but you yourself have served honorably in our military. So many thousands of men and women have, tens of thousands who have served in Iraq, they've served in Afghanistan, and thousands more who have not come home from those wars. At what point do we as the American people start demanding responsibility, if for no other reason than to say, why are we sending our sons and daughters, fathers and mothers off to these wars to fight against groups and then arming the next generation of fighters who will ultimately claim American lives as well? Last word on that.
That's always been my complaint, is you don't send our men and women to die. You don't waste our blood and our coin when America is not directly at risk. And there's no doubt that ISIS is a threat to the Middle East. There's no doubt that Islamic terrorism is a threat to the United States and our way of life. But ISIS is not a direct threat to the United States. And to send our young boys and our young women there to die seems senseless to me, especially when there is no clear plan on how you're going to achieve victory.
And that is exactly the problem. Jason Stapleton, former U.S. Special Operations Marine, host of the Jason Stapleton program. Thanks so much.
Thank you.